I just want to say that if you want more information for the workshop, you can check or visit saltonline.org. And also, if you have any questions during the presentation and the conversation, please use the comment section in the YouTube. Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz. İsmail Ertürk'le beraber yürüttüğümüz Para ve Çevre Atölyesi'nin 4. açık buluşmasında bugün konuşmacımız Manchester Müzesi ve Manchester Üniversitesi'nden görevli Bryan Sitch olacak. Eğer atölyeye dair daha fazla merakınız varsa ya da SALT'ın programlarına dair saltonline.org'u ziyaret edebilirsiniz. Ayrıca sunum esnasında, program esnasında sorularınız olursa YouTube üzerindeki yorumlar bölümünden Türkçe ya da İngilizce sorularınızı iletebilirsiniz. Bunlara da bakıyor olacağız. Thank you very much. Now I'm giving word to İsmail Ertürk to kind of frame the conversation. And thank you, Bryan, and thank you, İsmail Ertürk.
Thank you, Onur. Teşekkürler, Onur. Thank you, Bryan, for taking part. It is a Sunday, so you're taking your Sunday time, a holiday time. So thank you very much for contributing to this series of talks. We started by looking at the energy consumption by in producing money, especially in the context of Bitcoin, which has become more topical recently. And now in this final talk, you'll guide us through how money itself, in its own physicality, represents environmental issues. So over to you, Bryan.
Thank you, Ismail. I should say before I begin speaking that I'm not a financier, and what little I know about the world of finance, I think I've learned from Ismail over the last couple of years since we collaborated on a would-be exhibition about money and the environment. And sadly, because of lockdown, that exhibition couldn't happen. But out of that, I think out of that research has come some very interesting work around Manchester Museum's collection, which include about 60,000 numismatic coins, medals, and other specimens, which obviously we use together with our natural history collections and other collections to promote them to the public and to address environmental questions, and also we try to promote better understanding between different communities. So I shall begin my presentation by saying that the physicality of money has often been used in the past to make very, very explicit reference to the creatures that live in the landscape, in that environment. And also we have to bear in mind that the chief sources of wealth in ancient societies and in much more modern societies have often been portrayed on coins. I'll also touch in this talk on the way that the very mining of precious metals to create coins in itself causes a problem, as you would imagine. I'll also, during the course of this talk, I'll be touching on aspects of the history of money, which I hope will be interesting to a more general audience. So, as I said, we have some examples here of the way in which the sources of wealth, or even the landscape, or the creatures that live in the landscape, can be depicted on coins, a medium of transaction for the basis of exchange. So here we can see an ancient silver coin of the ancient Greek city of Metapontum in southern Italy, showing an ear of grain, which clearly was very important to the city. But nowadays, the depiction is perhaps more sophisticated in that very, very important messages are conveyed on the coinage, on the banknotes, for example, showing creatures that are threatened with extinction. And also later in this talk, I'll be asking Ismail to help me with the explanation of very sophisticated financial means of protecting wildlife through bonds and so on. So these arrangements are increasingly complicated and sophisticated, and they're far beyond me as a very humble curator to understand. So I'll ask Ismail to come in later on that. I'll touch on to begin with, just on the origins of coinage. I'm not going to say very much at all about commodities that have served as a medium of exchange, things like cowrie shells or wampum in the Americas that was used by Native American Indians as a means of exchange. I'll go direct really to the 7th century BC and Lydia, and the first coins as we understand them that were created by the Lydian state at that time. And they are, as we can see here, relatively crude in comparison to modern coins, but still recognizably coin-like. And very often they depict a creature sometimes associated with power or status, for instance, the lion. And I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking that even here with the first coinage, we have a kind of a direct link between coins and the environment, although I think not in a way that was intended by the Lydian authorities. Our saying, by the way, to be as rich as Croesus comes from this time, the king of Lydia at that time. The depiction of the lion, I think, is quite interesting thinking about it, because we know that lions were actually living in places like Greece in the Greek Bronze Age and in the Near East. And it's very likely that the lion that inspired the Lydian coins was actually a creature that was relatively well known, or remembered at least, at that time, but now has disappeared. So we find echoes of it in Homer's Iliad, for instance, but it had disappeared within so many hundred years of that time. So these are relatively crude. They're little more than lumps of metal with a stamp on them, but I think they do denote what we can understand as or recognize as some of the first coins. With the ancient Greek city-states, who took up the idea of coinage very enthusiastically and relatively quickly after the Lydians, we see very considerable elaboration, sophistication of the techniques of die cutting and producing what I think, certainly in comparison with modern coins, are literally works of art when we see the depiction of a god, a goddess, a deity, or as we've seen, something that represents possibly the source of wealth or a claim to high status on the part of the Greek city-states. Each of these states was fiercely independent. Each of them had its own foundation myth, and many of these foundation myths are represented on the reverse of the coin. The goddess Athena, for instance, for the famous statues that were produced by Athens, and her owl. There's another famous one depicting a boy riding a dolphin that was used by Taras or Tarentum in southern Italy. And also the ear of wheat that we touched on earlier for Metapontum. These are allusions to the source of prosperity of those city-states. And I'd like just to spend a little time talking about city-states in Cyrene that used a particular plant that is called Silphium, or was called Silphium, because it is now extinct. This is an example from the museum's numismatic collection, and you can see depiction of the deity on the obverse of the coin, and then on the reverse, this rather peculiar plant that looks a bit kind of almost a bit like Nelson's column, but with very, very floral extensions coming out of the sides. It looks very unusual. But actually, it is quite similar to a coin that's, very similar to a plant that still grows, the giant fennel. And just draw your attention to this depiction of the giant fennel from the museum's herbarium collection. Compare it with the Silphium. You see they're remarkably similar. And even when you look at depictions of the seeds of the plants, they're quite similar. They're different, slightly different, but similar. And the importance of the Silphium plant to the North African economy was very, very important indeed. And it was a major industry in ancient Greek times and particularly Roman times. We know it was produced, it was grown in large quantities and exported all over the Mediterranean world. We have descriptions of the plant. It is said that it had many uses. So the leaves tasted rather like our parsley, and you could boil or roast the stalk. It was perhaps a bit like celery, the texture of celery, but it also had the taste of fennel. And this served a wide variety of purposes in cooking, and I believe is also claimed to be something of an aphrodisiac or even a method of birth control too. So all sorts of qualities and properties were assigned to the Silphium plant, and the liquid that was extracted from the plant, laser, was used as a medicine and in cooking. Now, we don't know precisely why, but it became extinct towards the end of the ancient Greek, early Roman period. And certainly there's a reference in ancient Roman histories to the very last clump of plants. So it's very sad, I think, being presented to the Emperor Nero. This is in the mid to later 1st century AD. And people have speculated on why the plant disappeared. Could have been it was because it was so important agriculturally and commercially that there was too much. The agricultural process was simply too intensive to support all those plants. They became diseased, and or they changed the method of harvesting and grazed animals on the land afterwards, so that the plants or the seeds disappeared, leading to its extinction. This I find a little bit far-fetched, because the people who were extracting so much wealth from this plant, I would imagine, would have taken greater care with cropping and harvesting regimes. So I think the jury's still out of there. Possibly climate change, possibly disease, possibly changing agricultural production methods led to its demise. So all we can show here is the echo of the plant on the coin, which I think in itself shows or reveals just how important this plant was. We can also map, I think, the impact on the environment of coins, particularly the extraction of precious metals from sites such as Las Medulas mines in northern Spain. There is a very good and very detailed account of the extraction process in the ancient Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who's very interested in the Roman economy and had face-to-face meetings with the Emperor Vespasian. So he's very well connected, very interested in industry and commerce, and what happened to money in the Roman Empire. One of the writers, incidentally, who comments on how much money was literally kind of draining out of the Roman economy to be spent on things like spices and silk and other commodities coming from places as far afield as China. So this is Pliny's description of what happened in this process. This is all to do with very high pressure water being fed through adits or mines to literally wash away the soil and make the side of the mountain collapse. And he says the mountain, rent to pieces, is cleft asunder, hurling its debris to a distance with a crash which is impossible for the human imagination to conceive. And from the midst of a cloud of dust, or of a density quite incredible, the victorious miners gaze upon this downfall of nature. It's a very dramatic piece of writing. We can actually see the impact on the landscape even today. And you can visit Las Medulas mines, and it's actually a heritage, a UN heritage site that visitors, tourists and so on can go and see. And it's quite remarkable that the impact on the landscape is still visible, something like 2,000 years after Pliny was writing. Another example that we could touch on, incidentally, just talking about the impact on the landscape, is the very famous site at Potosi in Peru, in South America. And as obviously this was the product of Spanish and Portuguese discovery of the New World in the 15th, 16th century. And I suspect probably the people the Spaniards and Portuguese who found the site were very excited, because it would have confirmed to them beliefs in El Dorado and the fabulous riches in gold by South American civilizations, but also the wealth of precious metals that were available within the landscape, if only people took the trouble to look. And we know from work on Potosi over quite a long period of time, that very, very large quantities of silver were extracted, and later mercury was used as a way of extracting silver from the silver ores. And as we all know today, mercury is an extremely poisonous metal, and once it gets into the environment, it can kill lots of creatures, and it affects the health of human beings. And I think it's very very salutary to think that it was something like 40 years, I believe, before the first child was born at Potosi. So polluted had the environment become because of the use of mercury. And all I can say is it must have been a hellish place to work and live. And I think we have perhaps some indication of that from this very, very interesting sketch or drawing that was published by Zach Zimmer in Technology and Culture a couple of years ago. I'm very grateful to Ismail for sharing that with me. And of course, the reason why this was happening was not simply this fascination with stories of El Dorado. Silver was extremely important to the Spanish Empire at this time, but also was being transported across the Pacific to China, and was lay behind part of the economic success of the Chinese Ming dynasty. Of course, what we're looking at is coins made of precious metal, and the impact on the environment of the extraction of these precious metals could be very significant, as we've seen. One place, I think, which helps us to understand the transfer from purely metals and other commodities for use in transaction to the modern form of, or relatively modern form of, paper money. One country that helps us to explain that, of course, is Sweden in the 16th and 17th centuries, when, because of a series of ruinous wars, the economy had become so bad that the Swedish people, the financiers of the time, were having to rely on striking large lumps of copper to use as coinage. And there are a range of these copper plates. They're very considerable size, and some of the largest can weigh up to 15 kilos in weight. So completely, shall we say, impractical in that sense. You know, if you can imagine people having to use these plates as currency today, and the kind of holes that would wear in your pockets, were we in that position today. And of course, this was an extreme measure that was resorted to because of the financial difficulties of those times. And it wasn't long before someone proposed to King Carl Gustav that a better medium of circulation, a better medium of currency would be paper. We know, of course, that the Chinese had paper money for centuries before the 17th century, but it was something of an innovation in Europe at that time, though a number of countries were actually experimenting with paper money about this time. And this, I think, is again, going back to the history of money and the perils of finance and the economy. I might point out that this gives us quite an early example of one of the dangers of using paper money, and that is that if you print too much of it, it can create high rates of inflation or hyperinflation within the economy, which is a major problem. and something that I think many European economies in the 70s had to, well, certainly the British economy in the 70s had to contend with. Despite the problems, the high inflation that was caused because the Swedish bank produced too much paper money, despite these problems, we know that the paper money, use of paper money was relatively popular in Sweden because it was so much easier to use than these huge plates, these heavy copper plates of money. And of course, by creating the paper money, there needed to be an organization behind that to vouch for the authenticity of the money and its value. And that came about through the Stockholm's Banco in 1656. That was later replaced by the, beg your pardon, by the Sveriges Riksbank, which still exists today. And through the Royal Coin Cabinet, the Economy Museum in Sweden, very grateful to them to be able to show this beautiful photograph of one of the early notes that was produced. And you can see that it's mostly textual and signatures, and nothing like the very ornate, very sophisticated designs that we find on modern paper money. The reason for that being, of course, that it's to deter counterfeiting. So this takes us really into the next stage of the talk, which is to talk about paper money and the kind of designs, because once people took up the idea of placing designs on the banknotes, the elaboration, the sophistication of those images rapidly became very considerable indeed. And as I said, that's really to do with the need to deter counterfeiters, but also I think because of the need to inspire confidence in the money. And that I think explains why in some cases we can see, often on the reverse of the banknotes, the source of the wealth that lies behind the money. So, for instance, in some of the African countries here, we can see that these are agricultural products such as cocoa and coffee and bananas in some cases. On the more developed economies that have industrialized, we find depictions remarkably of heavy industry factories with chimneys that are literally spewing out carbon dioxide and other harmful gases. David Standish, actually, who wrote very entertaining book, The Art of Paper Money, in 2000, he refers to these notes as depicting the romance of industry, and I'm sure he does that very much tongue-in-cheek, because when you look at these scenes on the banknotes, this is not romantic in the least. It actually conjures up images of Potosi or even Las Medulas, and the destruction of the environment, the destruction of a landscape. These places look like hellish places where we would not want to spend any time at all. And just an example of a kind of modern variant on that is the depiction of the oil refinery on the banknote of Kuwait at the bottom right of the screen there. Now, we talked about hyperinflation, and we can look to a very good example, very famous example of the perils of using paper money just after the First World War, with the German economy and the resort to the papier mark. This really was the situation was brought about by the fact that Germany, as all the Western powers did, spent huge amounts of money and wealth fighting, raising money for munitions and so on to fight that terrible war. And after the war, the Germans obviously had banked on being the victors in that conflict, and they lost, and they were asked to pay very heavy indemnities to the other countries, to the Allied countries. And one of the ways to pay reparations, but also try and get their economy back on track after the war was to print paper money. And this worked only for so long before perhaps inevitably there was simply too much money in the economy chasing too few goods, and people lost confidence in the money. And one of the consequences of that was high inflation. And we have some very dramatic photos from that time showing just how worthless that money became. So here we have a lady on the left. This is thanks to Science Photo Library, by the way, their collection. Lady on the right, sorry, who is using practically worthless German banknotes as a form of fuel for cooking. Because it would actually be more expensive for her to buy fuel in the form of coal or wood or whatever. It actually makes better sense for her to use the paper as fuel for her cooking. And it shows you just how worthless the money had become. So again, it's another indication of how important it is that the money in use, if it's not a precious metal, is trusted and has to be vouched for. And so we take this on trust. We often refer to this kind of money as being operating on a fiduciary system on the basis of faith. So the money itself does not have intrinsic value, but we agree that it has that money and it's vouched for is guaranteed by the government, by the financial authorities. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say that all paper money is bad, far from it. And as I've said, paper money has been used. We've seen with the example of David Standish that paper money has been used in a huge number of ways to depict the sources of wealth, world leaders, in some cases, famous women, though sadly not as many of those as male leaders. Also, talking about wildlife, David Standish drew together some statistics, and he showed that something like one third of the world's available money, or the countries that were producing money at that time in 2000, one third of them were actually depicting birds. Now, we're not saying that all of these reflect concern about the environment, but I think it's an indication that wildlife does appear on paper banknotes, and increasingly, I think that interest in depicting wildlife has been directed towards expressing concern about the long-term survival of species and concern about landscapes, concern about the possible extinction. So here we can see some South American, particularly Brazilian banknotes, showing, for instance, the jaguar at the top on the 50 reais note, but also we have a golden lion monkey, which is particularly endangered in that part of the world. Turtles we know of from the Mediterranean, for instance, but across the world are facing very, very serious challenges. The orangutan at the bottom, another very, very famous species, threatened with extinction. Perhaps less known are creatures like this, the white-winged guan, or Penelope albipennis, which is in great danger nowadays. And I was looking this up earlier. Apparently, there are only something like 200 individual birds surviving. But fortunately, the Peruvians have set up a zone where they are protected, Laquipampa, in northwest Peru. And I think one of the interesting points here is that what's been essential in trying to preserve this species is the cooperation of the local community, and I'll come back to that shortly. So taking a step back from the actual money and just thinking about higher level financial measures to encourage people to want to preserve the environment and the creatures that live there, and want to challenge or face the challenge of climate change. We know that over the last 5 years or so, financiers at very high level indeed, including people like Guy Depel, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, were expressing awareness of the need that in drafting monetary policy, that there really need to be great attention taken, great attention paid towards climate change. And I think certainly 5-10 years ago, there was at least one current of opinion that was arguing that what we were seeing across the world was not global change per se, but just part of the variation in the weather patterns that we might expect to see on the planet. But I think this has hardened in recent years, and I think there's much greater acceptance now that climate change is a reality, and that as part of our future financial planning, it would be wise to actually try to encourage people to live and act and behave in such a way as to tackle some of the causes of global climate change and environmental change, and also to try and bring about the preservation of some of those beautiful creatures that I showed earlier, represented on the banknotes, that were threatened with extinction. Through no fault of their own, they're disappearing as their environment is being affected both by humans and by global climate change. So this challenge has really been at the forefront of thinking at the European Central Bank, Bank of England, and other financial institutions across the world. And the Brookings Institute, just a couple of years ago in 2017, said that the disruption that was caused by extreme weather events and attempts to mitigate the impact of these made forecasting the economic future much more difficult. And it's always seemed, I think, to someone who's not involved at that level, a bit like gazing into a crystal ball. But clearly, climate change made this even harder than it would have been anyway. So it's clearly a major challenge, a major problem. It's been taken account of at very high level in some of these very strategic financial documents that are being drawn up by the world's financial authorities. Now, one of the ways in which we can see this operating, I'm obviously very grateful to Ismail for drawing my attention to this during our research for the exhibition that we worked on about 18 months ago. One of the I think very, very interesting example of how this might work in practice is the bonds that are being created to protect particular species in particular parts of the world. So now we have a rhino bond, and this is worth up to $50 million. And the idea is to encourage people, the people in that part of the world and the investors, to want to preserve the population of the African black rhino, because they will derive a financial benefit from the long-term preservation of the species. And I think this is really, really interesting, and a very practical, pragmatic way, I think, forward for helping to protect these species in the future. And one of the, Ismail can explain this far better than I can, but one of the things that built into the way these bonds are designed is that the yield, the money that investors derive from taking out the bond will be greater the more that the rhino population thrives. And I think this is really, really interesting, very, very practical, very pragmatic way forward. And I think we look forward very much to seeing how these work out in practice. Now, at this point, as I say, I'm not a financier, so I'm going to ask Ismail to just step in here and just explain this amazing diagram that shows how the bonds work. If you don't mind just explaining that for people who are listening, Ismail, I'd be very grateful.
I mean, without going into too much detail, I mean, following on what Bryan showed you in the previous slide, how the financial system is coming up with innovative ways of conserving nature, animals, and this is a part of that trend, which is called bio credits, and this is a visual representation of how these instruments that are called biocredit work. As you can see, starting with number one, the community and the local knowledge is important. So here is an attempt by money managers, rather than dictating on local population what should be done. They need the contribution and knowledge. So this is a design of a credit that can be used for conserving nature, and involving several stages. Of course, there are also risks. What appears to be a harmonious sort of coming together of various interests, interest of people who invest in these things expecting a return, conditional to helping nature and environment. How this system in practice works is also important, because sometimes what is seen as a harmonious, rational, logical, in practice it may serve certain stakeholders' interests more than others. But what is interesting here is how, from Bryan's presentation, money in its physicality tells a story about its relation to nature and an environment, and is how today high finance is trying to link itself to the environmental issues. Over to you, Bryan.
Thanks, Ismail. So my last slide, by way of a summary, is this very colourful, very beautiful banknote from Rapa Nui, or Easter Island in the Pacific, one of the world's most isolated places, literally in the middle of the Pacific, as far away from any other kind of land as you could imagine. And I hasten to say these are not actual legal tender, shall we say. They're actually produced by the island, and they are sold to tourists as souvenirs. But they're very striking banknotes because they're depicting the famous Easter Island statues, or moai, and I rather think that had these been around in 2000, David Standish would have loved to include these in his book on the art of paper money, because he seems to spend a lot of time complaining about how boring US banknotes are, and how many other countries have much more beautiful scenes, designs on their banknotes than the United States. And I think he would love to include this one if he was writing that book today. The fact that these were produced on Rapa Nui or Easter Island, I think it's really, really interesting, because a huge amount of archaeological research and ethnographic research has been conducted on Easter Island since its discovery, well, at least by Europeans. Polynesians had known about the island, obviously, for far longer, but certainly so far as Europeans are concerned, the islands seem to tell a story of the degradation of an environment, the chopping down of the trees and so on, the human beings doing what human beings have done so many times before in the past, as we've seen in this presentation. They actually destroyed the environment in which they lived, and in some cases destroyed the source of food or the source of commerce on which they depended. Although that is, I hasten to say, hotly debated, and some people would say actually Rapa Nui, Easter Island is a very good example of the ingenuity, the innovation of human beings to survive in very difficult circumstances. But I think that aside, it's certainly true that the island now has come to symbolize that relationship between human beings and the environment in a way that almost makes it a kind of test case, a study that symbolizes the whole world. And one of the really, I think, salutary points that Dr. Paul Bard and Dr. Flenley make in their Easter Island, Earth Island back in the early 90s was this conclusion that if the people living on this tiny island had proved unable to manage their resources and ultimately chopped down the very trees on which they might have depended to make a canoe to sail away and go and live somewhere else, if that happened on this tiny island and the people couldn't control their relationship with the environment, what hope might there be for the rest of the world? It's using Easter Island as this kind of case study symbolizing human beings' relationship with the environment and the landscape and the climate. And I think we've seen in this talk, particularly with the drawing of attention to threatened species on banknotes, but also using these very sophisticated financial measures that Ismail so kindly explained for us. It's clear that there is a huge concern about what is happening. That the world is changing, the world's climate is changing, the impact on the environment, the landscape, and so on, the disappearance of creatures, species, their extinction, and so on. So we do know that despite this being a very serious situation, people are taking steps at a high level to try and address this. But it's not simply due to financial authorities to resolve this world-changing challenge. It's up to us all, and we all have to do our bit, whether it be in recycling or not buying particular things that are damaging the environment, not using particular products, or trying to use what we buy more responsibly and more economically. I think this is really important message for us all today. And if you take anything else from this talk, and he's touched on a great many things in passing, if you take nothing else from this talk, do think that it is up to us all to do our bit, and we obviously look forward, hopefully, to the future, and hopefully we'll see species like the black rhino and other creatures strengthening their population. But as we've seen, there's a huge amount of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. This has been most illuminating in showing us how money in its physicality engages with issues of nature and environment throughout the history. I think one of the things that you and I discuss, obviously with SALT as well, science can tell us a story by using its own language and numbers, but then the artifacts that the museum has, like numismatics collection, and then what galleries do by curating art events and exhibition. Those activities too can tell us a very strong story about our relationship with with nature, as you've as you have done brilliantly. So could you tell us then how this numismatics, museums, art organizations can contribute to telling us a story that complements or works together what the scientists are telling us?
I think certainly one way in which museums and other organizations can help, and in this I include, for instance, artists and designers who very often seek inspiration in museum collections and work very closely with museum curators. I think one way which they can do that is to explore the potential of collections to provide case studies from the past, but not only that, to provide material that provides the inspiration for artists to present these concerns in new and different ways. So, for instance, textiles might be presented in a very kind of artful way in a gallery. We know that there are some companies now that are actually recycling old textiles to make them into very, very new and actually rather fashionable garments, and this obviously prevents those garments ending up in a rubbish tip where they generate harmful gases and so on, and take up a lot of room. And if they can be reused and repurposed, then why not? And some of the organizations, some of the companies out there actually going out into the environment, and they're collecting plastics for reworking into textiles. They're gathering up what some people would regard as rags, and they're reprocessing them. And these things are, yes, they're becoming things that we wear every day, but they're also potentially becoming exhibits in museum displays of the future that will say, look, this is one of the ways in which we can all contribute to tackling global climate change by, for example, recycling old textiles and not simply throwing them in the bin.
Yeah, so following on that, I mean, thank you for referring to some of the things that I've done. But I mean, I learned from you because I wasn't aware of Silphium. It is when I started to talk with you about these things, and then you mentioned Silphium, and then how the Manchester Museum has that had a big impact on me because I mean, at the moment we are discussing the issues of environment and climate in civilizational scale. Yeah, a civilization can end. But then Silphium shows us civilization did end because they didn't care for environment. I mean, of course, Silphium was one city-state, but important for the Roman Empire nevertheless. So one single sort of coin can tell us how, you know, a civilization is at risk. So what would you say about the power of looking at those coins and thinking things, a single coin telling us a story of a civilization?
I think it goes back ultimately, Ismail, to the very importance of museum collections and as you referred to, the physicality of objects, physicality of specimens, and the fact that we can look at no end of images in a book. We can hear them discussed, perhaps see them in as moving image on the TV, or hear about them on the radio. But actually, the potential to actually see them in the round, in the 3D, and as a museum, we at Manchester Museum we try to encourage our visitors school groups and so on, not only to see and find out about these specimens, but also in some cases to actually handle them. And we find that the very ability to handle the material, to come up very close to it, obviously this raises issues for the long-term preservation of these objects, but the gain to public understanding by sharing this material with the public is so much greater than if we were simply showing an illustration on a blog post, for instance, or in a tweet. It's a very different kind of experience, and it enhances people's understanding. And I think these are the ways in which some of these really important issues can really be driven home to the public when they have a direct experience of them, because these are things that they have themselves handled and experienced. And the kind of stories that they throw up about long-term preservation, the failure of, and in some cases, this was beyond the control of the financial authorities of the time, but sometimes you do ask the question, look, how could they be so stupid as to not want to preserve the Silphium plant? How could they be so stupid as to let the last plants disappear and die out, when clearly it didn't disappear overnight? Presumably it tailed off over a period of time. Why are we not aware of attempts to try and redress that situation? Perhaps there were, perhaps it's a fault of our written sources, but sometimes you do ask, how they could simply allow this to happen. And clearly, we don't want people looking back in so many hundred years on us to say, how could you stand aside and not take the steps that were needed to try and address global climate change when you had an opportunity?
Right. I would like to end this with some positive a note that's in my nature, as I'm sure you follow, and then people who are interested in these things follow. In England, we have seen white storks, first time in the last 300 years, I believe, because there's a white stork project. And then I've also read recently how in Belfast, after 100 years, they have Belfast oyster. So the nature has a tendency to come back. So maybe we can write collectively to the Bank of England, put white stork on the next banknote, and Belfast oyster on the banknote.
I think that's a great suggestion.
Right. Well, thank you very much again, Bryan. And now I'll pass to Onur.
I would like to thank both of you, and also thank the audience who has followed this session and the other sessions. We are now came to the end of the Money and Environment Workshop Open programs. I would like to thank everyone again who followed, and have a nice day.